Hello again. Here's another question for the yes or no treatment, and it's one with some currency at the moment. The question is homeschooling a good idea? Now, of course, what's happened during the coronavirus is that, for the most part, children, kids in secondary school are at home being, if they're lucky, taught online. And in the process, of course, parents who, if they're around and are isolating or shielding or whatever, find themselves involved in education, find themselves in the homeschooling process by default. Well, that's not what I'm talking about in this video. What I'm talking about here is the process whereby parents remove their children from school or never enter them into school in the first place so that they can teach them at home. In other words, the intention is to have the education take place in the home. It's a growing phenomenon, and it's one not without controversy. Here in Britain, for instance, the government is a bit concerned about the quality of content, the skills involved by parents at home in teaching their children, perhaps in the kinds of values that are being inculcated in them and so forth. So there's a constant back and forth between those who want to be sure that the kids are getting a good education and those who oppose government interference no matter what. So anyway, it's a live issue. Okay, well, what are some of the arguments? Why would someone say, no, wait a minute now, homeschooling is really a good idea? I guess in no particular order. The first one might be the notion about what you might call adaptability or flexibility. And that is that in homeschooling one can devise one's own curriculum. One can decide what subjects are important, which ones aren't, which are to be discarded, which to be emphasized, which ones are best suited to the skills and the obvious ability of the child in question, and therefore it makes possible, as it were, a kind of a bespoke or internally designed program that just suits what that child needs. Of course, it assumes that the people doing the designing know what the child needs and that those are good decisions. But nonetheless, that's a big benefit. Along the same lines, it also provides parents the opportunity to prevent children from being exposed to teaching in school of which they don't approve. This takes many forms. It takes issues of ideology, things like approach to sex and gender preference. It has religious connotations, cultural connotations, and so forth. So for parents who want to design, as it were, a kind of pure environment for their children, this is the obvious route. Others, of course, often have children with special needs. They're slow, they have difficulty absorbing information, or they have limitations of one sort or another that make perhaps in their particular catchment area a life in conventional education just an impossibility. It just doesn't work. They're not so fortunate in their area to have special schools that deal adequately with the particular problem that their child has, and so they once again take it upon themselves to design the proper kind of approach and curriculum. Another one has to do with the quality of fellow students and their behavior. Some kids get bullied very badly to the point where their lives are in misery. They just simply don't want to go to school anymore. or there might be criminality and drug taking and all kinds of bad behavior that the school isn't adequately controlling, and so the parent decides that the child is much safer and in a healthier atmosphere by being at home and being taught by them. Another benefit is the notion that you don't have to be limited by a one-size-fits-all approach to education. Sitting in a classroom with 20 or 30 other children, the process of reaching those children is necessarily diffuse. It has to take place at the pace, perhaps, of the slowest children. Not always, but sometimes. Whereas at home, you can absolutely focus in on what your child needs and perhaps be more, although more intense, more efficient about it. You can get across what needs to be gotten across, specifically designed for that children, and not be held back or diverted by the needs of others. Another great advantage, of course, is the flexibility in scheduling. You can take family holidays at a different time from everyone else and thus have lower airfares because you're not all trying to leave at the same time at spring break or half term or whatever. You can really design your year around both what makes sense for the child as well as what makes sense for the parents and what their holidays are and so forth. So there's a huge advantage for being able to kind of devise your own formalized calendar of education. One has only to read the papers about the complaints and the moaning about school holiday scheduling and the impact on travel and so forth that always takes place, certainly here in Britain. Well, that's a pretty good list of advantages, really, when you think about it. A lot of it has to do with the formal design of the program to suit the needs of your child, but also avoiding some unpleasantness of one sort or another as well. Okay, well, there they are. What about the arguments against those who say, no, homeschooling really is a bad idea? Well, first of all, some practicalities. It takes some time to kind of get organized, to design the curriculum, to make sure you have the course materials, to make sure that you're really up to speed with what's required and at each age. And if you have several children, it gets even more complicated. So the necessity to train teachers and have degrees and so forth is not irrelevant. It takes a lot of training to be a good teacher, and it takes a lot of input for the parent to take over those skills and to design an appropriate system. So it's a daunting prospect, and one shouldn't be blasé about it. If it's a situation where you are removing your child from school where the child has been in school and is now going to be schooled at home, there's going to be a huge adjustment period. The child is going to be concerned about not seeing his peers, perhaps maybe glad he won't see his peers, but nonetheless it's a huge change to be made for any child in his life to be every day in a really radically different kind of environment from what he's been used to. And for the parent as well, there's a huge adjustment. And if the parent, hopefully, is a non-working parent, it certainly requires a big change to their daily calendar and what they do. What time do they get up in the morning, and what time are meals, and whether there's exercise. And you have to think about all of those things, the things that are part of the daily routine for schools in general. Still in the area of practicality, of course, the older the child is, the more demanding subjects become, and the greater breadth of skill and knowledge required to provide adequate teaching skills. just the area of math, for instance. How many parents are really able to explain, kind of the more advanced aspects of mathematics, trigonometry, geometry, algebra, heaven forbid, calculus. Now, some people have been trained themselves. Some parents have math A levels, like my daughter. But not everybody does. In fact, probably not very many do. So that's going to be a problem. How do you get around that one? There's also an issue of the kinds of resources that they have in schools which you won't have at home, which you'll have to substitute for. And I suppose technology is a pretty good example. I mean, these days everything operates on the internet, on computers and so forth. So, you got to be pretty geared up for all of that. You have to understand it. You have to be good at it. And I suppose most parents these days of the age to have children are probably a lot more up to date than certainly my parents were, or even I was when I was their age. But that is a consideration, and so the resources that they have in school and the kinds of expertise that is on tap and so forth has got to be a major consideration in deciding whether you can even do it or not, or provide the same level of educational experience. And next, there's an issue of social interaction, being with one's friends. A homeschooled kid doesn't necessarily lose his friends, or not necessarily cut off from them, but he certainly has far less ability to deal with them on a day-to-day basis, with playmates, with friends, peers. In some cases, they may welcome that because they don't like the kinds of people they have to deal with, they get bullied or whatever. But for the most part, it's a removal from a very vital and one might even say essential growing up experience to be around people your age all day long, and homeschooling cuts that off. That's really quite a big problem. And then finally, there's probably quite a big financial burden. You may have to move from having, for example, two incomes to one income. One parent has to stay home and do the schooling. It'd be very hard to do this homeschooling with two parents in full-time work. Virtually impossible. So a decision may have to be made for one parent to quit. And in any case, the time being spent by the parent doing the teaching might well have been doing something else productive for which you now have to pay for extra help to do it. So in any case, there's probably quite a financial burden from going in this direction. Okay, well, there's a lot on both sides, and there's a lot of arguments, not so much against homeschooling, but why it's going to be quite difficult. And I suppose the real against argument is the kind of social withdrawal aspect of it, and the fact that could really result in some growing up problems. Well, what's my take on all of this? Well, as I reflect on it, I think there are probably some good reasons and some bad reasons for homeschooling and for basically withdrawing your children from the available public sector provided schooling system. By the way, when I say public sector, I also am talking about any form of secondary education, even if it's private schools, fee paying, and so forth, because many of those same issues are relevant. Not all, but for the most part, the same apply to every form of primary and secondary education. So what do I think? Well, I think the reasons are, some of them are valid and some I would question. The most obvious valid reason is just simply distance. If you live in the middle of the prairie on a farm, you're going to have to homeschool because there just isn't any school anywhere near you. So that's as simple as that. So people in that situation have long since dealt with that. either by sending the child away to some form of boarding school, and therefore coming up with that as a solution, or by homeschooling. Another pretty valid reason for homeschooling is the one about the special needs student, where there just simply isn't the facilities available to deal with that child's needs in the available school system. Now, of course, one can press for that and lobby for that and try and make alternative arrangements even on a boarding basis. But those are hard to do, perhaps not very likely to succeed, expensive if it involves going away to school and so forth. But that's a valid reason for homeschooling, I would have thought. And then the other really valid one, I would think, is the one where the school atmosphere is just dreadful and you don't want to be part of it. The bullying goes on at an unacceptable level, isn't adequately prevented by school authorities. There's violence in the school, drug taking. Depends a lot, of course, on the neighborhood and the catchment area where the school is located, but a lot of schools simply fail in their ability to manage these things, and understandably, a lot of parents don't want their children to be part of that kind of atmosphere. Yeah, I can agree with that. Then there are some other more dubious, in my view, explanations and rationales for homeschooling, particularly around wanting to protect children from value systems and ideologies of which the parents don't approve. Many parents in America, for instance, who are creationists, who believe that the teaching of Darwinism and natural selection and so forth is the devil's work, and therefore they don't want their children to even be exposed to such evil. And similarly, don't want children to be exposed to liberal views of gender and gender preference and all of the current thinking about that. Or they may be part of a very tight fundamentalist religious group that simply doesn't want their children to be exposed to anyone other than members of that group. Well, all of those things I heartily reject and disapprove of, simply because what you're doing is restricting your child's ability to think, to understand the world around him or her, and you could almost be accused of brainwashing or making zombies out of them. That's an awful thing to do to a child, and I would definitely disapprove of that. That's why I'm quite in favor of, here in Britain, the government's concerns about these things and their inclination to try and interfere and monitor and make sure they know what's going on in either homeschooling arrangements or in very confined schools that don't allow any outsiders in. Okay, there it is. It's a tough subject, and it's one that people constantly deal with. It's one that's become more prominent in recent years, and it's one that, of course, whose kind of technology and skills have been tested a little bit by the coronavirus situation. So I'm sure that as time goes forward, we're going to hear more about this. Perhaps it'll be a bumpy ride. Well, hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give me a like, subscribe, notify, comment, etc., etc. And I'll see you at the next one. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.